The old wooden sign hanging from the tree warned visitors to stay off the jungle path. But its paint was so worn in its message, so faded that it could have just as easily been advertising an all-you-can-eat buffet. So when Mark, Brad, and Josh set out into the humid jungle, they didn't even register the warning before them. They were too busy arguing about which of them would get to name the baby. "I'm gonna name him Joshua," Brad said, grinning at his friend. "And I'm gonna call dibs on naming the girl," Mark replied, nudging Brad in the ribs. "I'm not naming my daughter after a tree," Brad scoffed, swatting Mark's hand away. Josh kept silent, opting instead to push through the thick foliage blocking their path. The friends had come to this remote part of Borneo in search of adventure, and perhaps a bit of enlightenment. The dense rainforest and dilapidated shrines spoke of ancient secrets waiting to be unearthed. But what they actually found was a rusty old key and a narrow trail leading deeper into the tangled green. It was clear that the well-worn path had been made by animals, since it meandered right up to an abandoned hut. A chill ran down Josh's spine, and he suddenly wished they'd brought a machete. But Mark broke the silence with a snicker. "Looks like we finally found something to fight over." He pointed out a rocking chair on the porch of the hut. "Rock, paper, scissors," he said with a grin. But as soon as Mark set foot on the creaking porch, the rocking chair stopped abruptly, and as if a giant hand had reached down and pressed pause on a film reel, the sounds of the jungle, the chirping of crickets, the distant calls of exotic birds, and the gurgling of a nearby stream, all vanished. An oppressive quiet settled around the friends as they stared at the darkened doorway of the hut. Then Brad screamed. It was the kind of scream that came from someone who just stepped on a twig and thought it was a snake. This was a primal sound born of terror, and it echoed through the silent trees. The friends stood frozen for a moment, listening to the echo fade away before turning to look at each other in horror. Before either of them could utter a word, a deep voice boomed inside the hut. "Welcome, children, to my humble abode." Then the door creaked open, and the friends gasped. They expected to see a wizened old man with matted hair and dirt caked under his fingernails, maybe a tribe elder dressed in ceremonial garb, or even a wild-eyed hermit. What they did not expect to see was a shadow. A tall, slender shadow with long, sharp claws and eyes that burned like hot coals in the gloom. Mark cried out and stumbled back. The shadow smiled, revealing rows and rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Don't be afraid," it rasped, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "I won't hurt you unless you want me to. You are my guests, and guests are always welcome here, aren't you?" It tilted its head, and for a moment the friends could have sworn it winked. Sure," Josh stammered, trying to put some space between himself and the shadow. We wouldn't mind staying for tea and crumpets." "Excellent," the shadow purred, stepping aside to allow the friends to enter the hut. "I insist you come in. You must be exhausted from your travels. Why don't you sit down and make yourselves comfortable while I rustle up some snack?" With a slight nod towards the porch swing, the shadow disappeared back into the darkness. The friends looked at each other, their faces pale in the gloom. They knew they should run, but their legs felt heavy and their feet rooted to the spot. As the minutes ticked by, the friends grew more and more uneasy. Mark shifted uncomfortably. "This place gives me the creeps," he whispered. "Do we have to wait until sunset to leave?" Josh hissed, pressing a finger to his lips. From inside the house came the faint sound of whispers. They were too soft to make out the words, but they seemed to circle around the hut like a swarm of angry bees, growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. The front door burst open, and the shadow beckoned him inside, with a flourish. "Come in, tea's ready," it rasped. As the friends stepped across the threshold, they found themselves in a large, cavernous room lit only by slivers of moonlight filtering through cracks in the walls. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like macabre Christmas decorations. In the center of the room was a rickety table surrounded by 4 mismatched chairs, and on the table sat a steaming teapot and 3 cups. The shadow poured tea into the cups without looking back. "Help yourselves, dears," it said. "And don't worry, it's perfectly safe to drink." Mark couldn't help but notice that there were only 3 cups. "Where's the 4th one?" he asked cautiously. The shadow turned, revealing a cruel smile. "Oh, I'm afraid the 4th cup is broken," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "But don't worry, my dear Mark. You're more than welcome to share a cup with your friends." The shadow gestured with a clawed hand towards the 2 empty chairs opposite them. But Mark and Brad didn't need a second invitation. They bolted for the door, flinging themselves through the opening and crashing into the undergrowth. The sound of their screams quickly faded into the night as they fled. Left alone in the eerie silence, the shadow slowly sipped its tea, its eyes gleaming with wicked amusement. It took another sip and sighed content. Children, it murmured, always so rude. No manners, no respect. It turned its gaze to the untouched cup on the table, and a single tear rolled down its soot-covered cheek. There's no one left to pour this tea for, it whispered. No one left to call me Grace. As dawn broke, a lone figure stumbled out of the jungle, his clothes torn and his face covered in scratches. The man, clearly shaken by his experience, hurried along the forest path, desperate to put as much distance between himself and the whispering hut as possible. His name was Josh, and he was the only survivor of the three friends. He made it to the car and collapsed into the driver's seat, fumbling for the keys. As he drove away, he glanced back at the imposing wall of trees that hid the hut from view. Just then, his gaze fell on the camera lying in the back seat, its lens smudged with dirt. With trembling hands, he picked it up and turned it on. On the screen, his own terrified face stared back at him, his mouth forming the words, "Stay away from the whispering hut." Then the image flickered and changed, revealing the smiling face of his friend Mark. "Don't go," he said, his voice echoing from beyond the grave. "You'll love being trapped here forever. It's so fun. Just don't go yet." As the camera clicked off, a cold wind swept through the car, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. They circled the vehicle, growing louder and more insistent, until Josh could make out the words they were saying. "Next," they hissed. "You're next." Josh slammed his foot on the gas pedal and the car screeched forward. He risked a glance over his shoulder and gasped. On the forest floor behind him lay a collection of small pebbles. But as he watched in disbelief, the pebbles began to move, slithering closer to the road like a wave of black blood. With a final scream, Josh swerved onto the rough jungle path, disappearing into the thick undergrowth. But the whispers followed him, seeping into his mind and wrapping themselves around his heart. "Run," they whispered. "Run away, little Mort. We're coming for you."